All right, History 131, Chapter 18, The Age of the City. There's a lot of stuff in here that I'm not going to go into in detail. There's a whole section on, what do they call it? The rise of mass consumption, income in consumption, leisure in the consumer society, spectator sports, music, theater, movies, patterns of public and private leisure. It's all pretty interesting, but it really only affects a part of the population. The working class at this point is usually working, if you have a job, you're working 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, 10 hours a day, and usually a half day on Saturday, okay? Then you have off on Sunday, but in a lot of places in the United States, there's nothing to do on Sunday because they have these blue laws where you're supposed to be respecting the Sabbath. And so what you're supposed to be doing is reading the Bible, I guess, going to church and reading the Bible. There's a long struggle to get professional baseball allowed in certain states on Sunday that I think is fascinating, right? But the important things are, first of all, the enormous immigration to the United States in the late 19th century. In the, there's like 25 million people that come between 1865 and 1915. It's 4 times more than the previous 50 years, from 1815 to 1865. The character of it changes in the middle. Until about the 1880s, most of the immigrants are coming from Northern Europe or Northwestern Europe. British, Irish, Germans, Dutch, Scandinavians. And, but after the 1880s, it shifts to Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So you start getting Italians, Greeks, Poles, Hungarians, Russians, who else? Among those people, there are the first really large immigrations of Jews to this country. So it creates like a very diverse population. I like to point out there's I don't know if your textbook has it, but there's a nice pie chart. It's like the definition of a pie chart. I always like to point out that the Germans are the largest immigrant group. And, when I was growing up in Brooklyn, it seemed like everybody was Irish or Italian. I guess some of the Jews could have been, the Jewish people could have been German. I don't know. But apparently if you go out to like the Midwest and, Milwaukee and places like that, there's a lot more Germanness about it. There's a figure, the percentage of residents in a city that are foreign born, so they're first generation immigrants. It gives the figures 87% of the population in Chicago, that's almost 9 out of 10 people are foreign born, 80% in New York, 84% in Milwaukee and Detroit. I think New York City today is about 40% foreign born. And if you go hang out in certain parts of New York City, you would think it was much higher, but at one point it was 80%. 8 out of 10 people would have been foreign born, right? There's a whole thing about assimilation and exclusion, and you should probably read this because it's a process that continues to go on. It's always like the last group that got in is turning against the group that's coming next, okay? The Irish were here when the Italians came, and there was all this stuff about they can't be assimilated, they'll never be true Americans, blah, 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 blah. And then as soon as the Italians are sort of risen up a little bit and got a few politicians elected and stuff like that, got some power and communities, they turn against the next group and say, oh, they're not they can't be assimilated. That's the fact of the matter is the United States will assimilate people. All right. When I was in elementary school, it was a very Sicilian neighborhood. It was a Catholic school in a mostly Sicilian neighborhood. And every one of my friends, it seemed, had a grandmother that dressed all in black because her husband had passed away and she was still in mourning years later. And the grandmother only spoke Italian, okay? And she was the foreign-born immigrant. She was the one that came here from Italy, okay? My friends could all speak enough Italian to say, it's okay, Grandma, we're just going to hang out on the stoop and don't worry about it, okay? Their parents probably also spoke Italian, but were much more American, whether they came here as young children or they came here or they were born here, okay? And my friends, of course, were thoroughly Americanized, baseball, blah, 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 rock and roll music, the Beatles, they played electric guitars, da, 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 da. They were thoroughly Americanized. It's a process that takes time, maybe a long time, maybe a couple of generations, but it happens. Another example is I worked for a guy, a Korean man, who had bought this liquor store in Brooklyn. And years ago I was working for him making deliveries and whatnot, stocking shelves. It was him, his wife, and his daughter who was like 8 years old, And she was going to school. I think she had been born in Korea, but in Brooklyn, she was becoming an American. She was, listening to music that he didn't approve of. She was dressing in ways that he didn't approve of. Her attitude was becoming, non-Korean. I think the real deal was that his wife was becoming non-Korean, and that was blowing his mind. But he said to me one day, he said, I didn't want her to become American. And I was like, well, why did you bring her to Brooklyn, That's what we do here. We turn people from other parts of the world into Americans. It's inevitable, right? There's some interesting theories about communities and stuff like that, how ethnic groups will stick to a particular community where maybe there's a church at the center of it, and then stores grow up that, sell Italian newspapers and sell Italian food products and stuff like that. And you get like these little ethnic enclaves all over the place. And eventually those break down and people, move all over the place. So this connects with the previous chapter was about industrial supremacy and forming unions. And this is one of the connections the textbook doesn't make. In the 1880s, the 1890s, the workers in a given factory or on the railroads or wherever were all from different ethnicities. And many of them did not speak English very well or at all. And so it's hard to kind of get people to form a union when there's such diversity like that. But by the 1930s, it'll be a case that, there'll be Polish Americans and German Americans and Italian Americans and Irish Americans and Black Americans and da-da-da. But they all are sharing a certain culture. They're sharing language. They've all been to public school or a religious school. They all have the same, a lot of the same background, basically. And it makes it easier to form a union. There's a whole section on how cities are kind of being redesigned, and I'm going to skip over. If you're into architecture, it's a good section. And then there's the beginnings of, think about like this vast movement of people into cities, mostly on the East Coast, but also Chicago, Detroit, other places out there, and the problems that arise. There's a shortage of housing. There's a shortage of work. One of the reasons there are so many immigrants is that employers are sort of trying to bring more people over. Employers want more people than, they want a group of unemployed people. They want a surplus of workers, so that for everybody that's on the job in their factory, there's 5 guys, 10 guys, 15 guys outside the door waiting to try to get that job. Because it disciplines the workers, it keeps them on their toes. People are reluctant to, talk about unions or complain about pay cuts and stuff like that, because they would just lose their job. So you have this vast amount of people coming in, and the housing doesn't meet the need. People are crammed into these apartments. They call them tenements. They're kind of slummy. There's not a lot of light. Sometimes there's not water and those kinds of things. So it's a problem. There are other problems in city life. And one of the important things that comes out of this chapter is the idea that, at least for city governments, municipal governments in this period, the idea that the government has an obligation to help the community to sort of function starts to arise. It's kind of a part of our fabric here today, but it wasn't always. At the time of the Constitution, the government was supposed to be, like, basically keep its hands off, take care of defense and diplomacy and like 2 or 3 other things. But now this idea is coming up that the government, the city government, is responsible for the housing crisis, has to deal with fire prevention, has to form police departments that are reasonably uncorrupt, has to legislate environmental things. You can't have just waste being dropped into canals and stuff like that. So as the problems mount in the cities, the municipal governments begin to respond in a way that creates a new idea about what the government's responsibility is. And around that, I'm not sure exactly, it's a chicken and an egg kind of thing, but around that comes a style of politics that we call the machine and the boss. Okay? And it's very partisan, meaning most of the big cities in the United States on the Eastern Seaboard are controlled by Democrats. Okay? There are some, I suspect, that are controlled by Republicans in this era. There was a series on HBO years ago called Boardwalk Empire, and it was set in Atlantic City in the 20s, and that machine was a Republican machine. So they both kind of work the same way. For the Democrats, like in New York City, they would meet the immigrants as they're coming off the boat, and they would help them out with find them a place to stay, find a family a place to stay, maybe find a job for the husband, the father, and just make sure they were sort of settled and okay. And in return for that, they expected these people to vote for them, vote Democratic. And there's no secret ballot yet, so it's easy enough to check on election day who's voting for whom, okay? Now, in some ways, this is totally corrupt. It's selling votes. In another way, it's basically providing social services that nobody else is providing. The party becomes the important body, the important political connection, okay? And they're taking care of you, not the government, not the mayor, not the city council, but the party is taking care of you. Your son gets arrested because he got in a fight in the bar. You go to your local Democratic, they call them ward healers, and he calls up the precinct captain, who's also a loyal Democrat, of course, and your son gets out of jail, you know, that kind of thing. Sometimes if people were out of work, they would bring coal or groceries, and it was like there was no welfare, there's no unemployment and that kind of thing. So the party is kind of doing these things. But there is this whole thing of corruption. So it's a kind of two-edged sword. It's taking care of certain things that need to be taken care of, but then it's also kickbacks on construction projects, and people learning also, people learning ahead of time where a subway was going to go and making a fortune off of buying land that, suddenly appreciates in price and stuff like that. But for a long time, maybe 20, 30 years, this is how politics was done in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, probably Baltimore, Chicago, I don't know, probably all the cities, all right? The most famous boss was a guy named William Tweed. He was the head of New York City's Tammany Hall in the 60s and the 1860s and 70s. There's a courthouse in Lower Manhattan called, I think it's called the Tweed Courthouse, and it's a beautiful building. It probably cost 12 times more than it should have because of all the kickbacks and money that was being made on the side on this building. But it's still it's a very nice building. So there's that. I don't think there's too much more that I want to talk about in here, but let's see. He talks about baseball. That's for me, that's an important thing. Basketball was invented in 1891 in Springfield, Massachusetts. I'll tell this story, though. When they invented basketball, they just put a peach basket up on the pole, and it took them a while to figure out to cut out the bottom. So every time a basket went in, they had to get this ladder out on the court and take which is, it's kind of like the limits of the human brain at some points. Basketball is a great game. This guy invents the game in 1891, but it takes them a while to figure out to cut out the bottom. Okay? I think it's kind of strange. And then the final thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite places in the world, Coney Island. Okay? It's an amusement park in Brooklyn. The first, 1903, I think, is when the first Luna Park opens up in 1903. It provided rides, stunts, lavish reproductions of exotic places and spectacular adventures. They had Japanese gardens, Venetian canals with gondoliers, a Chinese theater, a simulated trip to the moon. Who wants to imagine what a simulated trip to the moon was in 1903? And reenactments of disasters. A year later, a competitor opened named Dreamland. They had a 3-ring circus, chariot races, and a Lilliputian village from Gulliver's Travels. They hired all these little people to like live in the amusement park in this kind of like, like a 1700s kind of housing and stuff, and clothes and stuff like that. But they just lived there, and the attraction was that people could look at little people dressed in the 1700s style down there. Okay. 1904, the average daily attendance at Luna Park alone was 90,000 people. And there's a thing in here that I find fascinating. He says most people found Coney Island appealing in part because it provided an escape from the genteel standards that governed so much of American life at that time. Okay, it's kind of strict codes of behavior out in the world, what we would call puritanical. Women are dressed from head to toe, like the collars come up to here and the dresses go down to the ankles. In the amusement parks of Coney Island, decorum was often forgotten, and people delighted in finding themselves in situations that in any other setting would have seemed embarrassing or improper. Women's skirts were blown above their heads with hot air. People were pummeled with water and rubber paddles by clowns, and hints of sexual freedom as strangers were forced to come into physical contact with one another on rides and amusements. And apparently, in 1903, 1904, that you're on some ride where people are tumbling down and you come in physical contact with a strange woman or a strange man, and it's just like sparks go up. Okay. Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, the guy that interpretation of dreams and stuff like that. He came on a trip to the United States and insisted on going to visit Coney Island, because I think he thought it was a manifestation of part of the mind of humans. I think it's the id, the sort of primitive, instinctual part of the mind. And I just love that idea of Freud on the boardwalk after seeing these rides and stuff like that, trying to make sense out of these crazy Americans. Right? All right, that's it. One thing. I screwed up the dates for things, and I'm sorry. But I did produce a sheet, and those are the valid due dates. It's usually later than the ones I'd given earlier, which is part of the reason I changed them. I thought they were too early. But each of the courses, the 131s and the 117s, both have a list of due dates for discussions, for artifact assignments, and for the papers that we're doing. Okay, so that sheet is the definitive one. Okay, the other thing is it's going good with the course messages. People are sending me course messages rather than emails, and that's good. And I hope you're all doing, well enough. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a course message. And we've been pretty good about that. And I'm going to try to get on a better schedule with these video lectures so that we're moving along. Okay. All right, have a good day. I'll see you soon.